You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
Those words, spoken by someone who understood loss in ways most people never will, echo through what is about to unfold inside these palace walls. Prince William had entered a private Windsor meeting expecting a difficult family conversation about procedure and protocol. He did not expect to encounter his mother's name being used as the center of an accusation so powerful it would divide everyone in the room and force a king to choose between the woman he loves and the son who is grieving. But when Diana's brother placed a confidential file on the table and directly confronted Queen Camilla over a calculated plot involving how Diana's memory would be controlled, William's composure collapsed. The future king was suddenly no longer an heir defending the crown. He was a grieving son reliving a wound that had never truly closed. And his tears that day would become something far more important than emotion. They would become action that changed everything. This is the story of what really happened behind those closed doors at Windsor Castle. What was inside the file Spencer brought. What Camilla requested. What Charles was asked to sign. And why a princess's legacy became the battleground where a family finally chose honesty over institutional silence. Keep watching, because what unfolds in the rooms you are never supposed to see will force you to ask a question that cuts to the heart of who controls memory itself, and who pays the price when an institution decides a dead woman's story is something that needs to be managed. The world has always understood Diana in a particular way. A tragedy, a martyr, a woman whose absence reshaped the monarchy. Official commemorations paint her in careful strokes. Approved speeches honor her humanitarian work. State occasions acknowledge her son's grief. The institution manages her memory with precision, making sure that Diana is remembered exactly as the crown believes she should be remembered. But Diana's story belonged to more than just the palace. It belonged to the Spencer family, to her friends, to the people she touched, to her sons, who had to grow up without her while the world watched and judged and analyzed every moment of their loss. And most importantly, it belonged to her grandchildren, who would never know their grandmother except through the versions others chose to tell them. For years, this arrangement worked. Diana existed in an official space that the palace controlled and the family accepted. But things began to change when one of those grandchildren asked a simple question that an adult was not prepared to answer. And that question became the trigger for something that had been building quietly in the shadows for far longer than anyone realized. The world did not see this coming. The cameras were not there. No press release announced it. The palace released no statement. This was the kind of family conflict that institutions work very hard to keep invisible. The kind of pain that gets absorbed into silence and buried behind composed expressions and careful words. But silence, as Diana herself had once written, could never protect what mattered most. William carried that knowledge into Windsor. His uncle carried evidence. And King Charles, caught between his devotion to his wife and his responsibility to his son, would have to decide what mattered more. The institution, or honesty. But that is not all. Because to understand why Spencer brought that file to Windsor, and what was inside it, and why it destroyed something that Camilla had been quietly building for months, you have to go back to a moment that seemed innocent at the time. A moment when a young princess asked her uncle a question about her grandmother, and an older woman's fear of being forgotten or replaced suddenly became strategic action. Diana had spent her entire life being defined by institutions, by the crown, by duty, by the roles that others wrote for her. She had learned, painfully and publicly, what it meant to be controlled by a family that valued protocol over her well-being. And in private letters that she left behind, she had expressed a fear that would echo through everything that happened later. She was afraid that after she was gone, the institution would soften her story, rewrite it, control it, turn her into something palatable and safe and stripped of the parts that made her dangerous. She could never have imagined that her own grandson would one day have to fight to keep that fear from becoming reality. She could never have anticipated that her memory would become the subject of a secret framework, that her brother would have to bring evidence to the king, that her son would cry in a room at Windsor Castle not just for the mother he lost, but for the ways an institution was trying to make sure her grandchildren would never fully know her. William understands power in ways that most people do not. He has watched it move through the palace his entire life. He has seen how institutions protect themselves, how they manage narratives, how they decide what stories get told and which ones get buried. And he has spent his adult life trying to build something different, something that centered his children and their well-being rather than palace protocol. But even he was not prepared for what happened when Camilla decided that Diana's legacy was a threat that needed to be managed. The setup for everything was deceptively simple. A private family reception to honor Diana's charitable work. A gathering of family members on both sides. A chance for the palace to demonstrate unity around the late princess's memory. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would suggest anything darker was happening beneath the surface. But during that reception, something occurred that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Charlotte, William's daughter, asked her great-uncle Spencer a question. A child's question. An innocent question about her grandmother. A request that felt natural and normal and loving to everyone who heard it. And Camilla heard it. And everything that unfolded afterward grew from what she decided that moment meant. Spencer had answered Charlotte with warmth. He had told her that Diana's childhood home, Althorpe, held family records and memories that her grandchildren should one day be allowed to explore. He had extended an invitation that felt like a bridge between the official royal world and the family world, between the palace's version of Diana and the family's version. He had made a promise that would ripple outward and create consequences nobody anticipated. William had been nearby when it happened. He had seen Spencer's face as he spoke to his daughter. He had felt something shift in his own chest, watching his child ask about the grandmother she would never know, hearing his uncle open a door that he believed should always remain open. Catherine noticed his expression change. She asked whether he wanted her to go with him into the meeting that would happen later. He told her no. This was something he had to face as Diana's son, he said, not as the future king. She had touched his hand in understanding, sensing that whatever waited behind that closed door would reach far beyond palace procedure into something much deeper and much more painful. But that is not all, because Camilla had carried that moment with her into a conversation with the king. And in that conversation, she had planted a seed that would grow into a proposal that would be drafted into a framework that would begin quietly changing how Diana's children and grandchildren were allowed to access her memory. And by the time anyone outside the palace inner circle understood what was happening, preliminary instructions had already begun being issued. Guest lists had been altered. Visits had been delayed. The carefully constructed plan to place Diana's legacy under palace control had already begun its implementation. Camilla carried Charlotte's question to King Charles like it was a confidential document that required urgent attention. The reception had ended. The guests had gone. The official photographs had been taken and approved. But what had happened during those carefully controlled hours felt, to Camilla, like a problem that needed solving before it grew into something she could no longer manage. She told Charles that Spencer's invitation represented something dangerous. Not because the invitation itself was hostile, but because it opened a door that the palace needed to control. Direct access to Althorpe, unsupervised family archives, conversations between the children and the Spencer family that happened outside palace awareness. These created the possibility of competing narratives. Two different versions of Diana existing simultaneously. One official, one family, and if the grandchildren heard both, they might grow confused about who controlled the story of their grandmother's life. The king listened without interrupting. Camilla's concern sounded reasonable on the surface. Protecting children from confusion. Ensuring consistency in how they understood their family history. These were things an institution could justify. These were things that could be explained in memos and administrative frameworks. These were the language of control dressed up in the language of care. But Camilla's real fear was something she did not say out loud. She feared that if Charlotte and George and Louis heard the Spencer family's version of Diana, they might develop a different relationship to her memory than the palace wanted them to have. They might see Diana as a woman first before she became a symbol. A person with relationships and conflicts and a life that existed outside the palace boundaries. And that version of Diana was harder to control than the official commemorative version. Charles did not challenge her. He listened and appeared concerned and told her they should explore options. That phrase, explore options, would become the gateway through which an entire framework of control would slip into the palace machinery. Within days, Camilla met with a senior household advisor without William's knowledge. According to documented internal accounts, she described Charlotte's question as a symptom of a larger problem. The family narrative around Diana was becoming too diffuse. Too many voices telling different stories. What was needed was a coordinating framework. A system to ensure that all Diana-related engagements, commemorations, and family access went through palace approval. One center of authority instead of competing ones. The advisor took notes. By the following week, a draft had been prepared. It was titled the Diana Legacy Framework, though no official document would ever use those words publicly. Inside palace offices, it was simply called the proposal. And the proposal contained language that would later shock everyone who read it carefully. The framework recommended that future references to Diana be contained within a controlled royal context. Outside family participation would be sharply limited. Direct Spencer access to Diana's grandchildren would require palace coordination. Archival materials would be reviewed before being shared with younger generations. All of this was dressed in language about protecting the children and ensuring consistency, but the effect was clear. Diana's legacy would belong to the palace, and the palace alone would decide how her story was told. Charles received the draft inside his private study. No ceremony, no official presentation, just a folder that appeared on his desk with a note indicating it had Camilla's support. He read the first page, then the second. Then he reached the section concerning Charlotte and her request to visit Althorpe. The recommendation was that such visits be scheduled through palace offices and that visits would focus on approved historical materials rather than personal family records. Charles removed his glasses. He set the paper down. He did not sign it. But that is not all. Because the unsigned proposal should have ended there. A draft that was not approved should have simply disappeared. Instead, something happened that would set everything in motion toward the confrontation at Windsor. Preliminary instructions based on the unsigned proposal began being issued anyway. Keep watching, because what happened next revealed something about how palace power actually works when no one is paying attention. Palace advisors, believing Charles would eventually agree with what Camilla supported, began implementing preliminary versions of the framework. It was bureaucratic sleight of hand. Nothing formally changed. No official policy was announced, but guest lists for Diana-related commemorative events suddenly became more selective. Spencer representatives found themselves removed from preliminary planning committees. Charlotte's requested visit to Althorpe was quietly delayed, with vague scheduling conflicts cited as the reason. William noticed none of this immediately. He was occupied with his own royal duties. Catherine did not realize what was happening because the changes were subtle enough to hide behind administrative language. But Spencer was watching. And Spencer, who had spent decades understanding how the palace worked, recognized the pattern immediately. When Charlotte mentioned that her visit to Althorpe had been delayed for the third time, something crystallized in Spencer's mind. He began making inquiries. Through contacts inside palace offices and members of the Spencer family network, he obtained copies of internal memos. He reviewed guest lists that had been altered. He accessed documented evidence showing that his name had been removed from multiple committees. And he found the draft framework, the one Charles had never signed, but which was already reshaping how Diana's memory was being managed. Spencer did not hesitate. He did not follow protocol. He demanded a private meeting with the king. He told palace officials that he had evidence of a coordinated proposal designed to limit his family's influence over Diana's legacy. He insisted that this meeting include William, and he made clear that he would not leave without a confrontation. By the time William received notification that his uncle wanted to meet with him and the king at Windsor, Spencer had prepared his case with precision. He had gathered the documents. He had arranged them chronologically. He had created a narrative that connected Charlotte's innocent question to the palace proposal to the preliminary instructions that were already changing how the grandchildren could access their grandmother's memory. And he had brought Diana's own letter, the one she had written years earlier, during a period when she felt isolated and afraid that the institution would one day rewrite her story after she was gone. He intended to place that letter on the table beside the palace framework and ask a question that no one could answer away or explain away or hide behind administrative language. Charles was told about the meeting with concern and confusion. Camilla went pale. William arrived at Windsor expecting difficult but manageable family conversation. Instead, he was walking into an intervention that would force every person in that room to choose what mattered more. The closed door at Windsor meant that what happened next would remain private. No aides took notes. No secretaries waited outside. No household officials recorded the conversation. The only people inside that room were 3 men and 1 woman, and the ghost of a princess whose memory had become the thing they were fighting about. Spencer placed the file on the table without ceremony. He did not raise his voice. That made the moment more dangerous than any shouting would have. He opened the folder and arranged the documents in order. The framework, the memos, the altered guest lists, the delayed visit, and finally Diana's letter. He asked Charles a question. Why had the palace created a system to control how his grandchildren learned about their grandmother? What institution needed to mediate a child's relationship to family memory? And what kind of fear drove a queen to believe that her position could be threatened by a young princess asking about her grandmother? Camilla rejected the accusation immediately. She said Spencer was misunderstanding administrative coordination. She told the king that protecting the children from competing narratives was responsible stewardship. She insisted that nothing had been designed to harm Diana's memory or exclude the Spencer family. But William was not listening to the words. He was reading the documents, and as he read them, something shifted in his face. Catherine had prepared him for difficulty, but she could not have prepared him for this. William's restraint held as he read the first few pages. His face remained composed as Spencer explained the chronology. But when he reached the section that recommended limiting Charlotte's access to family archives, something inside him broke. The future king was no longer able to maintain the distance that his title required. He set the papers down. His hands were trembling. "My children are not political territory," he said quietly. And then louder, "My children are not political territory." Camilla turned toward him. "William, you're misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything," he interrupted. His voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. Charlotte asked a simple question about her grandmother, and instead of letting her have an answer, this framework treats that question like it's a threat that needs to be managed. Charles watched his son with an expression he could not hide. There was recognition there, and pain, and something that looked like helplessness. Camilla insisted again that she had only requested coordination, that the proposal was designed to prevent confusion, not create it. That nothing in the framework was meant to harm Diana's memory or exclude the Spencer family. Spencer then did what had required him to come to Windsor in the first place. He opened another page of documented internal conversation. The note had been recorded by the advisor who drafted the framework, and it contained words that Camilla had spoken in that private meeting. Words that revealed her true motivation beneath the language of administrative coordination. The note read, "Growing public comparisons between Charlotte and Diana could weaken her position in the next generation." Spencer placed his finger on those words and looked directly at the king. "Did she say that?" he asked quietly. "Did your wife express concern that your granddaughter's resemblance to Diana could become a threat to her place beside you?" Charles closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he turned toward Camilla and asked the same question. "Did you use those words?" She paused. The pause was everything. In that silence lived the answer that no one in the room wanted to hear, but everyone understood. William stood up. The sharp movement broke the careful stillness that had filled the room. He pushed his chair backward hard enough that it scraped against the floor with an awful sound. Camilla finally said that the comment had been taken out of context, that the advisor had misunderstood what she meant, that fear of comparison was not the same as fear of the child. But Spencer would not let the meaning disappear beneath another explanation. He reminded the king that the note, the meeting records, and the revised framework all pointed in the same direction. Everything connected. Everything showed a coordinated effort to distance Diana's family from her grandchildren. Everything revealed that Camilla had initiated this not because she feared confusion, but because she feared a young girl whose face reminded people of the woman who had once challenged her place. Charles closed the folder. For a moment, it seemed like he might end the confrontation by simply refusing to engage further. Authority, silence, the weight of the crown. Those were the tools available to him. But then Spencer moved his hand and placed it directly over the folder, stopping the king from moving it away. Silence protected this kind of pain once before, Spencer said. His voice was steady and final. It cannot be allowed to protect it again. The words hung in the air. Once before, after Diana's death, when the palace had chosen silence over acknowledging the depth of what William and Harry had lost. When young boys had been expected to perform grief rather than feel it. When the institution had asked them to protect the crown by protecting their own pain. William stared at his father. The critical moment had arrived. The decision now belonged entirely to Charles. For several agonizing seconds, the king said nothing. His silence did not calm the room. It transferred the weight of the accusation onto him. Everyone could feel it. Camilla had requested the framework. Advisors had drafted it. Spencer had exposed it. But only Charles possessed the authority to stop it permanently. Everything now depended on whether the king would protect his wife from humiliation or protect his son from another wound. But that is not all. Because Camilla broke the silence first. And what she said revealed something about the depths of what she believed about her place in this family. She warned Charles that abandoning the proposal in front of Spencer would make the accusation appear true. She told him that if he rejected what she had requested, he would be choosing a dead woman over his living wife. She asked him not to sacrifice their marriage to satisfy pain that had never truly disappeared from William's life. She made it a choice. Camilla or Diana, his wife or his son's grief, present loyalty or past love. William answered before his father could. His voice was quieter now, but the restraint made every word heavier. "I'm not asking you to choose Diana over Camilla," he told Charles. "I'm asking you to choose honesty over control." He paused, and when he continued, his voice broke again. "My mother's memory should never depend on which version causes the least discomfort inside the palace." Charles studied his son's face, and in that moment, he saw the same hurt he had witnessed after Diana's funeral. The same frightened boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin while the world watched. The same son who had spent decades protecting his own children from the pain that the institution had not protected him from. The king reached toward William, but the prince stepped back. His rejection of the gesture was small, physical, but it carried more emotional weight than any argument Spencer had made. Charles's hand remained suspended in the space between them. That small rejection, that movement of a son away from his father, contained everything that was broken and everything that could still be repaired. Then Spencer produced one final document. The internal schedule showed that parts of the framework were due to begin before Diana's next major anniversary. The restrictions would appear like routine administrative changes. The timing had been deliberately accelerated. Someone inside the palace, believing Charles would eventually sign because Camilla supported it, had already begun implementing the plan. Charles read the dates twice. He realized an advisor had taken action without final approval, assuming he would eventually consent, assuming institutional convenience would win. The king took a fountain pen from the table. He opened the authorization page of the framework, and with deliberate force, he drew a hard line directly through the document. The pen created a sound as it crossed the paper. That sound meant something. That sound meant the end of control. Then Charles wrote in the margin. His handwriting was precise. Every part of the framework must stop immediately. All directives connected to this plan are suspended as of this moment. A complete review of every action taken without authorization will commence. He set the pen down. The decision had been made. Not as a husband protecting his wife. Not as a king protecting his institution. As a father protecting his son. "The file is sealed," Charles said quietly. Pending full review. No one leaves this room without understanding that what happened here was wrong. Camilla sat isolated. William remained shaken. Spencer closed Diana's letter, the one she had written so many years ago about her fear that the institution would control her memory after she was gone. That fear had almost become reality. But a son's tears had transformed it into action. The meeting ended without reconciliation. There was no healing hug. No moment of restored family unity. Just separate doors closing across Windsor, each person carrying their own version of what had happened. Each person understanding that the landscape of the family had shifted in ways that could not be undone. Charles had made his choice. The cost of that choice would echo through everything that followed.